Hey everybody, what's up? Now, for those of you who know me, and maybe a lot of you do, maybe a lot of you don't. I've had a lot of new subscribers come to this channel, but for those of you who know me and for those of you who do not know me, let me just say that I spent many years as a floor trader on 4 different exchanges. I was on the New York Mercantile Exchange trading oil. I was on the Globex trading gold. I was on the CME trading S&P futures, and I started out on the New York Futures Exchange back in 1982 trading stock index futures. But I was an independent floor trader on all those exchanges, and I have to tell you, those were the days of the real open outcry. Electronic trading did not exist. Globex did not exist. As a matter of fact, I can tell you one story. When I was going through my membership at the CME in Chicago, this was late night, maybe November, December 1990 or early 1991. As part of the membership, we had to go through a 1-week classroom education sort of process. And I had already been a member at that time of the New York Futures Exchange and the NYMEX and the COMEX. I moved out to Chicago to trade S&Ps on the CME. And I remember at the end of that week, we had to take a test and everything. And then after that, one of the exchange officials came into the room and said to us, now we're going to take you to see something that is really going to open up your eyes, going to be very, very interesting for you. So everybody, we had to follow this guy. He took us out of the classroom, and we went into this room. And in this room, there are a bunch of computers on desktops. And back in those days, it's not like the desktop computers we have today, all colorful and, could do everything. I mean, these were just dark screens with green lettering, green symbols on them. And he got everybody around this one terminal, computer terminal, and he said, this is going to be the future. This is our system that we are developing called Globex. It's the electronic trading system. And we all kind of just, snickered to ourselves like, oh yeah, like that's really going to work. Because of course there was, prior to this invention of Globex and electronic trading, you had 150, 200 years of this open outcry system that functioned very, very effectively. I used to stand in a pit with 200-300 guys. Some of these pits, like the Eurodollar pit in Chicago, I mean, they had like probably 1,500 guys, any number of which you could have plucked out to play professional NFL football. I mean, that's how big and huge these dudes were. And it was raucous and it was crazy and people screaming and shouting and spitting on each other and sometimes get stabbed by pens and fights going on. It was unbelievable. But it was a system that worked. So when we saw that Globex thing, we were like, yeah, right, as if this is going to work. But anyway, what I want to talk about is in my experience on the floor, I learned a lot. I learned about how volume flows, how orders flow. I learned how people from the outside who are not on the floor, I learned, how they mistakenly and errantly put, stops and buy orders and sell orders. I mean, that's really how I use charts. It goes back to my days as a floor trader when, we knew where the stops were. I mean, back then, we used to talk to the brokers who had order books that they were holding the buy stops and the sell stops. They would tell us, okay? And so we'd be gunning for the stops, whether they were buy stops on the upside or sell stops on the downside, so we'd get a position on, and we push the market, even just buying one contract at a time. Like people on the outside, they didn't know. They didn't see the volume. They would just see the price flash up on the screen. If the stop was at 50, let's say, we'd be buy one at 45, buy one at 46, buy one at 46. We buy it all the way up to 50. But before that, we put on a big position, we'd buy it up using one lots, trigger the stops, all the buying would start, because those were the resting stop orders, and then we'd sell right into that and take our profit. It was like a money machine for us. So I learned a lot about that. I learned about charting in the way that we used to look at it on the floor, at least the savvy guys. Like, how do we pick the pockets of these people from the outside, right? So we had that going on. But the other thing that I learned and I saw with my own eyes was the big traders in each pit. And that was really an education for me, and that was a sight to see. Not just because of how much money these guys made, but, you know, their power in the pit, the way, two things. Number one, the way they controlled. I mean, you had guys, I remember there was one guy, and every pit had their guy, right? I mean, every pit that I ever traded in had their guy who was like the big monster. And we had there was a guy in the S&P pit, I remember very well. Tough guy from Chicago, street smart guy, very tough. Not much of a formal education, I would say, but just street smart and very tough. You literally had firms like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Solomon Brothers at the time when it existed, and Merrill Lynch. They paid people as spotters to sit there, to stand there in the pit and just relay back to the head offices what this guy was doing. One guy. And you're talking about one guy against these massive Wall Street firms, you know, that had billions and billions, and they were upstairs like, what? This guy's name was Lewis. What's Lewis doing? What's Lewis doing? It was really something to watch. It was an incredible thing to watch. But the one thing I remember about these guys, the ones who made the big money, and there were really two types of traders, successful traders in the pit. You had your very small fish, your little guys who would just scalp for one tick or two ticks, very quick in and out. And you could do that in the pit because you weren't paying any commissions, and you know, you could see the order flow, and sometimes you'd get the edge. You'd be able to buy at the bid and then turn right around and sell at the offer. You can't do that from off the floor. So you had those little guys like the little fish, you know, little swimming in schools of minnows, and they'd be picking away. And then you had your big guys, the whales like this, and they had they weren't looking to scalp and make a tick. They were building a position. They were holding that position, and they were defending that position. Now, none of these guys knew about MMT back then, and I don't even think MMT was a thing. I think it kind of got going in the mid-90s. I didn't personally know about MMT until 2002 when I started to, when I met one of the founders. Anyway, they didn't know about that stuff. They didn't even care about that stuff. But they did have a sense of the big macro trend. They did have a sense. And like, for example, this guy Lewis, I used to watch him, right? The market was going up and we're trading S&Ps, and he'd always be on the buy side. And back then I could never understand it because I was one of these still kind of green speculators. You know, for some reason, a lot of the guys in the pits, we used to love to sell the market. For some reason, we always thought it was going to crash. But Lewis was always on the buy side. And he'd be standing there sometimes, and he was always busy doing something. But when you saw the market go down, when there were times when there was selling in that pit, right, you'd have Lewis would be bidding at every tick lower. He'd be there like this, impervious wall buying. And it was him against, Goldman Sachs and Solomon Brothers and, Morgan Stanley. It was incredible. And I don't even know if he had sort of a macro understanding of the economy. I doubt it. He just wasn't that kind of guy. But something inside of him told him it's going up. He was right about that. And he stuck with it. And every time it pulled back, he was building his position. The guy made millions. He made millions. And the same thing with a guy like Tom Baldwin, who was the biggest guy on the Chicago Board of Trade in the bond pit. If you read the very first book, Market Wizards by Jack Schrager, Tom Baldwin is, he's one of the chapters in that book, okay? And he talked about, he went from nothing. He saved up a little amount of money. His wife was pregnant. He went down on the floor with like 25 grand. He said, I got to either make this happen in 6 months or I got to go find a job. In 6 months, he made $100,000. He went on his way to make hundreds of millions of dollars, and that was a lot of money back in those days, all right? Still's a lot of money. So you had these guys, and the reason I'm talking about this is they knew when you had these, first of all, they had this sense of the big picture in their head, okay? And they weren't swayed from that. And whatever caused them to formulate this big picture in their head, whether they understood the macroeconomy or whatever it was, whatever those conditions were that caused them to formulate this big picture, they knew in their heads that unless that changed, they were going to continue to do what they do, and more importantly, they were going to use reactions against that principal trend to build their position and protect their position. And that's what I tell you here, and that's what I tell my people. So today, for example, we are seeing a correction in the dollar. We're seeing a dollar rally, and I'm sure all the zombies are buying, and you're going to get articles on Zero Hedge saying, oh yeah, this is the pain trade. The dollar's going to go up now, and interest rates are rising, so it's bullish for the dollar, notwithstanding the fact that we've already seen 6 interest rates, and the dollar is way lower. They don't pay any attention to that. They don't know what's going on. They see something right now, and then they just attach some meaning to it, and right away they're running with it. Whereas the big guys, they're in there selling the dollar today, just as Lewis on those corrections back then when I was on the floor. I didn't know back then. I thought, oh boy, this guy's crazy. He's going to get buried. No, every single time he came out bigger. And I saw that in every pit when it came to the big guys. I mean, you had your little guys in every pit, your little minnows, you know, scratching around for a tick or two. But all the big guys, and there were never a lot of them. There was one usually in every pit, maybe two, but usually there was one guy. So what do you got to say to yourself? You say, how do I become the one guy? At least within your frame of reality, okay? We're all not going to be, you know, Carl Icahns or George Soroses or whatever. But how can you be your one guy, right? In your world, given your situation and your finances and everything, how can you be your one guy? You got to act like those other guys. And yeah, it's hard. I'm sure when Lewis was standing there buying, when Morgan Stanley was selling, when Solomon Brothers was selling, when J.P. Morgan was selling, when you know, Merrill was selling. I'm sure that took guts, but he was a guy who came from the streets. He wasn't afraid of anything, man. But that's how you have to think about yourself. I'm not afraid. Let your inner confidence come out. You get tough. You look at it as an opportunity. Not as, oh my God, everything is changing today for some reason. For some reason today, everything is changing. No, it's not. All right? So, work on being your one guy.